Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Hopkins. I'm the Associate Vice President for College Relations and Marketing here at the college, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's discussion. We're so pleased and honored to have with us today 5 presidents of the College of Wooster: Henry Copeland, Stan Hales, Grant Cornwell, Georgia Nugent, and Sarah Bolton. Many of you have had the pleasure of working with 2 or 3 or even more of these individuals, so lengthy introductions seem superfluous. Therefore, rather than repeat what you already know or what you have read in the program, I'll simply note that we have with us on stage a physicist, a philosopher, a mathematician, an historian, and a classicist. And from that very liberal arts mix, we promise to give you a rich and engaging discussion. So now it's about just about 2:40. So for the next 45 minutes or so, the presidents will offer their thoughts in response to a number of questions that I'll pose on the liberal arts today and on Wooster's distinctive place in the pantheon of America's best liberal arts colleges in particular. Then at about 3:30, we will open the floor to your questions. So without further ado, let's begin. We're here today to reflect on, to discuss, and to celebrate the liberal arts tradition, and one notable exemplar of it in particular. True liberal arts colleges are a small subset of American higher education, about 130 by the criteria the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching uses to count. And pundits have been issuing gloomy proclamations and predictions about our prospects for at least the last quarter century. Georgia, you've been president of 2 distinguished liberal arts colleges. You've been deeply involved in the Council of Independent Colleges and their efforts to strengthen and promote this whole sector of American higher education. Do you think there will be fewer liberal arts colleges in America, say 20 years from now, than there are today? Or like Mark Twain, have reports of our demise been greatly exaggerated?
Well, John, we're all gathered here today or this weekend to celebrate 150 years of a wonderful tradition at Wooster, right? So I think it would be both ironic and unfortunate if I were to respond, well, it's all over.
So it's not going to be that kind of panel. Okay.
But the fact is, I do not think that there will actually be fewer liberal arts colleges. One thing that we might keep in mind is that the most famous or notorious closing of a liberal arts college didn't happen. Sweetbriar is actually still in operation because of the love and commitment of many alumni of that institution. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about American higher education today and about liberal arts colleges in specific, and I want to say a word about 2 of those that I think are relevant to this question of, are liberal arts colleges going to suddenly disappear from the face of the earth, as it were, which, reading some pundits, you would think is going to happen. I think there are 2 characteristics that are not widely recognized about these kinds of colleges, about our sector. One of them is nimbleness and flexibility. I think there's a general sense that liberal arts colleges are very staid, they're very set in their ways, it's very difficult to make change, and the fact is that that's not actually the case. We see evolution and innovation in these colleges all the time, and I won't go over the history of that, but many of us have lived that history, whether it's new subjects being taught, new students being reached, and so forth. I'm in the midst now of a series of meetings across the country about innovation in liberal arts colleges, and I'm learning some terrific stories of really new thinking and ways of evolving our sector to meet new needs and new necessities. So one is that we are in fact flexible and change. The second is the value placed on liberal arts education around the world. And this is a rather ironic thing. I know Grant is very interested in this too. The American model of liberal arts education is being emulated in, I think, every continent in this world. Maybe not Antarctica, not sure about that. But in China, in India, in Europe, in the Middle East. there are educators and there are populations that are hungry for this kind of education, and new colleges and universities on this model are springing up. The irony is that we're being undervalued in our own country at this time, but I think that that trend is actually going to come back and bite us in a good way. That is that, again, the model will be evolved, it will be modified in other contexts, and I think that that learning will come back to the states and revivify what we do here.
Great. So picking up on the second part of what you were saying there, Grant, as Georgia alluded to, I know you have been and are very involved in liberal education in a more international context. It's one of your particular areas of interest. And you've been involved with a number of, for lack of a better term, liberal arts college startups in other parts of the world. Is liberal education viewed differently in any significant way outside of the U.S. In that different context? And are there lessons to be drawn from some of these new ventures?
Yeah, there certainly are, John, and I agree with what Georgia said. Let me first say that it's just wonderful to be back in Recital Hall here with the Wooster family. And I'm so happy that this is a presidential conversation and not a presidential debate. But to your question, actually I just want to pick up directly with what Georgia was talking about, because what's happening to the model of liberal education globally is fascinating. And the irony of, just as we in America, we invented this. This is the quintessentially American style of going to college. This is what it means to go to college. And actually, the rest of the world has been watching. And the higher education throughout most of the rest of the world is really based on the German university model, as opposed to this distinctive model of American liberal education. And just as we are questioning the value of this style of education, the rest of the world is saying, well, we've been paying attention to what's been happening in America, where innovation is coming from. What is it about higher education over there that is so very different from what we have done here that isn't as effective? And it's exactly the mission of Wooster. It's exactly the mission of liberal education. There are a couple interesting differences when you talk to these colleges. First of all, the terms liberal education don't resonate. They talk about an American-style education. They talk about a broad education committed to critical and independent thinking. They talk about all of our goals, essentially, without the term, because the term has no currency and actually leads to a lot of confusion, right? In India, if you talk about a liberal arts college, they think it's a college in the arts. In Japan, it has no resonance whatsoever. So the way it's being talked about is very different. But a lot of these places are students of what's happening here. And they're paying very close attention to actually the innovation that's happening still in America's liberal arts colleges. We remain the think tanks of American higher education. We are actually the places that innovation is happening. And then it's picked up at the larger places, and they try to reproduce what happens here, but they can never actually duplicate what happens here. And the world is paying attention. So I think it's just going to be a fascinating next 50, 100 years when all of that comes into concert with each other.
Actually, Grant, I'm thinking we should mention in this context Ashesi.
Exactly.
And Worcester's relationship with Ashesi, which is a great example of it's different from Worcester, but it's very deeply grounded in the same values.
So Ashesi is an American-style liberal arts college in Accra, Ghana. However, as most of these places do, it has a very particular Ghanaian African inflection, where it's a broad-based liberal education to educate a new model of African leadership. It's an incredibly inspiring place.
If I could just put in a footnote, though,
Absolutely.
and make a distinction between our liberal arts colleges, which have the fundamental disciplines, ways of knowing, and what I see going on is a slow erosion of that among many small American institutions in which applied subjects are being substituted for physics, for economics. And so the question is are those liberal arts colleges, or they're just a different kind of institution? Well,
I think in many ways this is the kind of concern, these predictions of demise go in cycles. And I think when you're as old as I am and some others are, you'll remember several iterations of those cycles. If you go back and look at a quotation in Jerry Footlick's book, a quote that Henry Copeland made back in the mid-'70s, there was a height of the concern and predictions of demise in the mid-'70s. And Henry wrote a beautiful piece about exactly that, the cycles, and that people should not have their attentions taken away by sort of a fervor that rises to a point and then falls away. And since that time, that fervor had fallen away, and it's now coming back to a particular height in that regard. The only other comment I'd make is maybe in keeping with Wooster's intellectual approach to good exegesis here. If you take all the terminology that we use, liberal arts, colleges, small, independent, residential, coeducational, a lot of people assume that all of those go together or you've lost everything. What I've seen an awful lot is schools that we think of very much as liberal arts colleges don't call themselves colleges anymore. They give themselves the name university for some other reason. But in fact, in many ways, they exemplify the kind of approach that we take. Other schools are just the other way around. They keep the name liberal arts, but as Henry just pointed out, the number of people in the English department is 2 and the business department is 35. And so it's really questionable as to how much they really do have that dedication to the liberal arts.
Yeah, so I'll jump in just to prevent you from moving on. But no, I think this question,
I know my place.
the question of what we mean by the liberal arts, right? What those words mean to us is a really interesting one. And Georgia pointed out at the beginning that has not meant the same thing in terms of what subjects it is for all time, right? So if we think about liberal arts in its original meaning, education with a particular purpose that's around building the capacity for civic engagement, right? Building a capacity for thinking, for analysis, building an understanding of what is in your surroundings, what led to that, what the possible futures are that could lead to. If we think about that larger context and the way that it draws in understanding human behavior, understanding the arts, thinking a little bit about what human expression looks like, knowing something about literature, knowing something about the sciences, that doesn't include or exclude any particular subjects within the definition. And we also think about liberal arts in terms of this question of exploration, right? We talk all the time about exploration, but in fact, there are places that are liberal arts colleges, like St. John's, a wonderful place, where their liberal arts education is specifically designed. These are your 32 courses, and you will take them in this order, and then you will be an educated person. So that's one kind of exploration. Right? There's other kinds of liberal arts exploration that happen at places that have no requirements at all. So they still call themselves liberal arts colleges, and by that they mean we offer all of these things, go to it, right? And those are not really the same in what they're asking of their students, but they name their mission in terms of the kinds of learning and the kinds of thinking and the personal and intellectual capacities they develop in the same ways. And so I think that what we're doing when we say we're a liberal arts institution is something that's really worth thinking about not only in terms of the particular subjects that we value because of the ways of thinking that they build, but also in terms of the frame and the goal of what we hope for the future lives of our students that they will then build. And so I don't think that has to shut out necessarily subjects that have not historically been within our purview.
Great. So let's zero in a little bit more closely on Wooster for a moment. Let's look 20 or 25 years down the road. I think it's safe to assume that we all agree that there will still be 130 or more liberal arts colleges in America, still thriving at that time.
I didn't agree with that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let the record stipulate. The number may fluctuate, but there will still be liberal arts colleges thriving in America. And it's probably safe to assume that there will be a new generation of pundits also predicting our imminent demise. But so in 20 or 25 years from now, Sarah, where do you think Wooster will be in that group, whatever its size is, and what will set us apart?
Excellent. So Wooster has long been a very distinctive place, right? Committed particularly to the development of every student through individualized education. And I think those core pieces will continue to be true. We will still be distinctive. I think we will still be important because we will still be producing an opportunity for learning in all of our students and a commitment to the study of all of our students that allows them to become particularly well prepared as leaders, as thoughtful, consequential citizens, as people who make good lives in a future that will be very different from the present that we now have. So I think that independent study will continue to be a part of that distinctiveness. It's hard for me to imagine a future in which learning to create new knowledge, pushing yourself beyond the boundaries that you think limit what you can do to a place that no one has gone before, or creating new musical or artistic expression. It's hard for me to imagine that that would no longer be an important part of helping students make the very most of their 4 years. So I think we'll still be distinctive, and I think individualized mentored education will still be a really important part of that. I think, though, that there will certainly be some things that have changed. We will have thought, I hope, about what else needs to happen. Are there other areas, for example, where mentoring will be important for our students? Do we need to think about mentoring students in the lives that they undertake in the community? Do we need to think about more actively letting students practice civic engagement or connection with the broader Worcester City or regional community, or even with the global community? Do we need to think about those as additional aspects of the education for every student? I think there'll be a broadening of the kinds of things that we ask students to undertake, as we're hoping to continue to be the place that prepares students best for their lives, for lives of consequence and leadership that is important. I think we'll also face another challenge in our distinctiveness, which is that some of the distinctive things that we started doing quite a long time ago, say 70 years ago, for example, in the case of IS, other people have noticed that those are good things, right? So they went from being things that just a few places did to being things that others realized were really important, and that now make their way onto a very reasonable list of higher education best practices, right? So if people go and look and say, what are high impact practices for helping students make the very most of their 4 years? Many of the things that started here at the College of Wooster, or that Wooster was on board with very early, are now on that list. And that's a good thing, right? That's a kind of leadership that we hold for higher education broadly. That means that the work of our community is being manifest not just in our own students, but in the experiences of students at other institutions in many places in the US and also internationally. But it's a challenge, right? Because you can't stay distinctive if everybody runs over and tries to copy what you're doing immediately, especially if they do a good job. And so we're going to need to keep thinking about that, right? Keep thinking about what is it that we do particularly well. Now, I will claim that even though everybody else is certain that they do independent study now as a best practice, and they are all on board with that, that we actually do that better. And I think that we do it better partly because we've been doing it for a long time. We've been thinking about how to do it well for a long time, and we've been thinking about how it connects to students' education from the day they set foot on campus, or even a little bit before that day, and the way that we carry through that arc. So I say we still maintain that distinctiveness, but as we move forward and people try to copy us, we'll need to stay sharp on our toes.
Anyone else like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, if I could add, I agree completely with you, Sarah, and thank you for putting it so well. You know, research is thought beyond Worcester, for the most part. Research is thought to be the province of research universities, and therefore really the province of faculty and graduate students. And I think that Worcester's distinctiveness now, and as it will carry forward, in the way we have embraced mentored undergraduate research as the very practice of learning how to solve problems. And that is the most highly relevant center of our mission, and really the mission of undergraduate education. And all of the complexity that entails, learning how to think critically and independently, learning how to write and communicate, learning how to collaborate. It's all part of that activity of research or problem solving. And I agree that Wooster can never be complacent and think, okay, well, we got that knocked. But as long as Wooster continues to invest, I mean, everybody in this room knows this. This isn't just something that Wooster does. This is what Wooster is. I mean, it's completely written in our DNA. And that kind of all-in commitment, I think, is completely distinctive.
I guess when you asked the question before, John, that where will Wooster stand among those schools, however many there may be, you're asking a question about something that is not so dear to the heart of any of us, and that is rankings. Because when people ask where do you stand, and people ask about rankings, I think all of us have great concern, of course, about that entire effort. We could be in the top 10 depending on how one does the ranking. I could create a number of criteria that would put us easily in the top 10. I could probably, or maybe it would be hard, someone could write one that could put us in the bottom 10, I'm sure, but that would be very hard, I would think. I suspect, unless we have some mammoth surprise, we may not be number one in terms of wealth. There are some schools that are very, very wealthy. We certainly won't be among the lowest in that regard, though, either.
If there are some people in the audience you'd like to address personally
That's right.
afterwards on that particular topic.
There is a campaign coming, of course, that may be the surprise.
Just
On the
saying.
other hand, I guess I would say that if we were to be ranked based upon the poise and the articulateness of our students, as exemplified last night by Sally and Scott and those, we'd be at number one easily. There's not a question there. But I guess you ask about what's distinctive. Certainly I would start with IS, but I would put it in a broader context in sort of two ways. First of all, we're not a copycat, as Sarah suggested. We're the originators of that, and other schools are the copycats. But I put it in a much broader context. It's a set of traditions, not just academic traditions, but overall student life traditions. We're the originators of an awful lot of those as well, and there are a lot of copycats out there too. And that's what I think in many ways also makes the college, it's the rich set of traditions, academic and otherwise, which set us apart in many ways. Secondly, it's a clear and honest student-centeredness. It's clear the students here that count most, and it shows up in so many ways. And I think that itself is something to be proud of owning. And then thirdly, and this comes from some of my experience in the consulting I'm doing now, it's the wonderful humility and lack of arrogance. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, there are folks that don't possess either of those. And one thing that sets us apart in a really wonderful way are those two characteristics.
Very true.
When all the colleges have folks wearing kilts, we'll know we're there.
Henry, I'd like to turn back to something that you touched on a little bit before. People tend to ascribe a certain timeless quality to liberal arts education. Now, sometimes they do that as a compliment, sometimes as an indictment. Do you think, from your perspective, is that accurate in your experience, or has a liberal arts education, and the way we think about it, changed in significant ways over the years that you've been involved in education?
Well, let me begin by making a distinction between the goal of liberal education and the ways we get there. I think the timeless quality is in the goal. And I would just sum it up. It could be done in a dozen different ways, but some introduction to the achievements of the human mind in which our lives can be made intelligible. It has to do with the goal of the process. Now, the way of getting there, of learning how to make sense of the world and ourselves, has changed. And I go into this next little segment with trepidation because a classicist is sitting at the end of the table. But for some 6 centuries, liberal education in the West, at least, was a study of the languages and literature of Greece and Rome. And by focusing on examples of literary art, which embodied the results of discerning intellects at work, the assumption was that the capacity of individuals to make refined judgments could be, cultivated. And even today, The most prestigious course at Oxford is in humane letters, known as the Greats, which is a study of the text of the ancient world. So, World War II, when they needed an individual to organize British industry for the war, they selected the professor of moral philosophy at Oxford to do that, a product of the Greats. Now, as late as the beginning of the 20th century, the curriculum of colleges as diverse as Fisk and Wooster included Tacitus and Horace in Latin, Xenophon and Sophocles in Greek. And as recently as the 1960s, most leading colleges at least required 2 or 3 years of Latin for entrance. Now, as was mentioned in the late 19th century, the German universities set the model, and there was the conviction that the different fields of knowledge, history, biology, chemistry, physics, each had their own methods for making sense of the world. And so liberal education became more about the ways of mastering 2 or 3 of these ways of understanding. So today, the liberal arts are an introduction to some of the vocabularies and grammars that we have available for understanding ourselves and our world. But what is involved in each of these areas of knowledge is different and is evolving. Geology was turned upside down in the 1960s by plate tectonics. Biology has changed in every decade of this century. My own field, the French Revolution, has undergone 3 distinct revisions, so that what I was taught in the 1950s at Cornwell is now considered just plain wrong. So the goal of the process is the same, to make our lives intelligible. The ways we try to do that have changed dramatically.
Thank you. Would the classicist like to have 2 minutes rebuttal, or any of the rest of you?
I'm refraining from saying it was so much better in the old days.
Sarah, one thing that certainly has changed at most liberal arts colleges, including Wooster, is the composition of the student body. Not just in terms of the most obvious things like racial and ethnic and gender diversity, but also personal history, family background, where all the various places our students come from today. Talk to us a little bit about both the challenges and the opportunities that go along with that new and much more diverse landscape in liberal education.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think you're absolutely right. One of the greatest evolutions of the college over its 150-year history is the increase in the diversity of our students as well as faculty and staff, the diversity of our community along every dimension: race and ethnicity, socioeconomic experience, certainly nationality and faith tradition are parts of that as well. Our first president, Willis Lord, intended the college to be open to all students when he started, and he was very explicit about that. But the realization of that vision has taken time. He had that intention, and I think perhaps the hope that once he just opened the doors to everyone, that that vision would become a reality. But really, it's taken us 150 years, and it'll take us some more time yet to make the most of that. But the progress we've made along that dimension, I think, is some of the most important progress we have made at all. I think that that's true because I think that the learning that students do here is stronger in every respect when there are a wider variety of experiences represented among the students as well as among their teachers. And that's because people do so much more here than just read or look at the resources that they're learning from. They talk with one another, and they are trying to figure things out, right, to make meaning from all of the data, all of the information, all of the things that are coming at them all the time. And that making meaning, we know that that's a very context-dependent piece of work. You can put the same set of information in front of different individuals, and they will make completely different meanings out of it. So if we want our students to go out into the world and be particularly strong at viewing problems, as you said, Grant, from many perspectives and figuring out how to solve them, one of the very best ways to do that is to have them engaging in this hard, meaning-making work, surrounded by other people whose experiences and cultures and faiths and assumptions about the world are completely different from their own. There's no better way to do that than to have that range around them. And of course, our students aren't just doing that in the classroom, right? They're doing that all day long in other places, in the dorms, in the dining hall, in their clubs. In all of those places, they're figuring out who they are in context of talking with other people who are different from themselves. And those moments outside the classroom and inside the classroom together, those come together to make what I think is the pinnacle of what we can do with a residential liberal arts education. And all of it is better, the wider range of experiences and perspectives that there are here. So I think that's incredibly important. You know, I think that despite being founded on the principle of access to all, as Henry said earlier, Wooster, like many institutions, was kind of ironically founded both on a principle of access to all and on a set of guidelines and expectations which actually related to a very narrow segment of society, right? So as well as saying that the college would offer an education to all of its students, men and women and persons of all races, on equal terms, the college also was founded on a particular set of cultural expectations. So in 1870, the requirements for admission, I looked this up, were passing an examination in Latin and Greek, including reading at least one of the Gospels in Greek, as well as doing a certain set of work around algebra, right? So that, you can say everyone can come, but I would just like a show of hands among the alumni who would have been admitted under those, Georgia, perhaps. So the rest of us, not so much, right? So there are things that colleges do, right, which have to do with both opening the way and welcoming everybody, but then actually, probably by accident, but not really noticing the way that you haven't, in fact, welcome everyone. And so the work that we do to examine who we are, the ways that we make deep welcome here, include thinking about everything that we do, right? What do we assume about students who come here, what they will know, what they will need to learn, how we can help them? What do we assume about what traditions will mean to them? Which traditions will resonate for different students based on the traditions they bring from home, which ones will feel welcoming and which ones will feel exclusive. There's a tremendous amount of work that we need to do to continue the journey to realize the promise that Willis Lord offered up in 1870 of an education for all that's offered on equal terms for every student. So that is a challenge, and it's a challenge that has to do in many ways with self-examination and with noticing the places where we may have accidentally or just with a kind of cultural blindness, missed something that we could be doing better.
I think this is one of the most interesting trends that we've seen in the last longer than a decade. I would say it's been going on for several decades now. And I go back to your metaphor, Sarah, of opening the door. And I think the original thought was all we need to do is open the doors. And it took us a long time to realize that what we need to do is massive renovation and rebuilding of the house. And we have been slow to some extent, I think, to realize that.
But I just want to notice that it's not a question of whether we do this. This is the only way forward. Access and inclusion is our only future, and it's a future we want to embrace. Now, having said that, the difficulty of the increasing difficulty of this work on campus is the difficulty of multicultural societies we see in our own nation and in the world. So nobody should think that somehow it's going to be, Disney World, if I may say, or some kind of Shangri-La of a kind of difference productively embraced all the time. It's very hard. It's going to remain very hard. And whereas we should always expect our campuses to be on a project of getting better at it, it's always going to be the case, I would say, that students are going to be impatient with progress because they should be. So that's just sort of a permanent condition of the mission that we've taken on in this era.
So let's shift gears just a little bit here. For at least a decade, there's been a drumbeat of criticism in the media and in Congress and state legislatures about the high cost of higher education. Complaints that too many people are taking on too much debt to earn degrees of what is deemed to be dubious, quote-unquote, practical value in the workplace. I'd throw this open to all of you, but Georgia, do you think there's any merit in that critique, especially as it applies to a college like Wooster? And then Stan, as a mathematician, is it possible or even desirable, do you think, to measure what we do and quantify the value of a liberal education in a way that would satisfy some critics?
Well, as you know, John, what I have been doing over the last several years is to take on a fairly public role of what I think of as myth busting. And so when you talk about cost and debt and the value added in employment and so forth, there are a couple of things that I like to put on the table first because they are not things that we typically hear in the public media. One third of college graduates graduate with no debt whatsoever or less than $10,000 of debt. The average American indebtedness for 4 years of college is now right around $25,000. That's not small, but the earnings differential for having that college degree is typically $1 million. So when you look at sort of cost and benefit, I think we don't see enough about that. And now there also seems to be a discourse out there that every graduate from a college like Wooster is serving as a barista at Starbucks. And the fact is that recent studies have been done over the last couple of years which show that graduates of our type of college are typically about 85% of them within 6 months are employed in the field that they want to be employed in. So there's a lot of disinformation out there. What is the case that we have to address somehow is that despite the fact that most families do not pay the so-called listed price or sticker price, still, there's no question that college has become more and more expensive than we would like it to be. And we have to address that as a society in many different ways that are not going to be easy, I think. One of them certainly has to do with the investment of our society in education. Certainly the publics have been wounded tremendously by the withdrawal of funding, federal funding, state funding, but it affects private colleges like us as well. I was saying to my colleagues, I had an interesting experience a few weeks ago. I was on a World Academic Summit where leaders from about 40 different countries, higher education leaders from about 40 different countries came together to talk about the future of higher education and so forth. And there was a really interesting panel. It was a panel of presidents, but they weren't all from the same college, right? And there was a president from the United States, from Great Britain, from Germany, and from China. And what was so striking was that the educators from America and Great Britain were very, very worried about the lack of interest and incentive among the public to support the value of higher education. And what was so striking, being an American, was that the leaders from China and Germany were completely dumbfounded by this. They repeatedly said, "What do you mean? Of course everyone cares about higher education. Of course the society wants to fund higher education." Unfortunately, that's not the society that we're living in right now. And if we want to see the kinds of benefits that we think a Wooster education brings, we have to change that picture. The other side of the cost equation that people don't talk about very much is the consumer-driven aspect of it. If you want many, many amenities, they actually cost. And we see very little about that, about the cost being driven in part by the desires of the students and the families who come to us. So I think there's a lot of change that we need somehow to begin to bring about to tackle that question, which is a serious one for families, how much it's going to cost to get the benefits of this kind of education.
I guess it's my turn as the mathematician to take up your challenge here. I think maybe like other mathematicians, I get concerned about the various ways by which people do decide to try to measure and to quantify the value of higher education. There are several choices people make in that effort, and unfortunately, I think they make a series of choices which are unfortunate. First of all, they look at this choice between vocational purposes versus non-vocational purposes of higher education, and they quite quickly focus only on the vocational. And then they say, well, all right, how are we going to measure the vocational value of the education? Well, unfortunately, it becomes too easily in terms of dollars. And then the next choice is what kind of dollars are you going to measure? And they then choose to measure the salary of the first job your graduates have. And that becomes, for an awful lot of people, unfortunately, the sole measure of the quality of the college. A very unusual way to rate the value of a school. For example, for one reason, it allows the institution to abandon all interest in the future of those students right from that point on. As long as they get them a job with a high salary at the beginning, they can forget about them for the rest of their lives. A very irresponsible attitude toward alumni, I guess I would say. So I guess I would come back and say, all right, let's go back to what other kind of choice someone might make. The non-vocational purposes and values. How are you going to measure those? Well, what are those non-vocational values? First of all, I would say just knowledge for knowledge's sake. Higher education is based very strongly on just the human value of knowledge for knowledge's sake, perhaps hard to measure. Secondly, to provide for the students a stimulating life of the mind, the basis for a stimulating life of the mind for their entire life. And hence, one excellent measure would be able to be to count how many books do your alumni read of their own will over the course of their lifetime. That, to me, is equally as valuable a measure of the success of one's higher education. And then thirdly, of course, the value to be a true citizen of the world and of your country. How many times have you actually chosen to vote rather than abandoning that choice to vote? Another way to value the kind of education one gives. If one's going to come back to the vocational side, if one somehow is forced into measuring on the vocational side, I guess I would say, let's look at the salary in the last job, not the salary in the first job, or maybe the total. If one has to look at dollars, I would look at the last job. And at least that's a mildly good point of view for a college, because the alumni tend to give to the college in proportion to the salary of their last job, perhaps more in proportion to the salary of their first job. But then I would go a bit further. If one has to base it on dollars, one could measure how many voluntary charitable gifts have your alumni made in the course of their lifetime. How generous have they been to charitable gifts? That's a wonderful measure for the value of one's education. And even more so, perhaps, how many hours have people donated for charitable purposes throughout their lifetime. If you want to rank colleges, our board comes out number one on all of those, for sure.
And we should mention, I think, that we should be proud at Wooster to be a part of the GLCA, the Great Lakes Colleges Association. And one of the most interesting pieces of work, I think, that's being done now is a different kind of effort to measure, if you will, but measure isn't exactly the right word, but to try and articulate what the true value is of this kind of education in ways that are more nuanced, broader, just the way that you're talking about, Stan, looking at the quality of life and the perceived satisfaction of a life of our graduates. And I really look forward to seeing that work completed.
Anyone else like to add thoughts on that? Because
It's well said.
so it's about 3:22, and we want to leave a good chunk of time for questions from the audience. And now would seem to be a good time to start that portion of our proceedings. So I will ask my two lovely assistants here, each armed with a mic. So, yes, anyone who's interested, just attract their attention, flag them down, and pose your question.
In the Democratic contest for the nomination this year, Bernie Sanders made a big deal of offering free college tuition to any young American, but what he meant by that was free tuition at any public institution. If that sort of movement gets seriously underway, what will be the impact on private education?
Well, I'll plunge into that impossible question first. First, that is not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. Right.
No candidate of any party has given any indication of how that would actually be funded. So it's an interesting thing to talk about, but I see no way that that is going to be funded. If we did try to move in that direction, it would have disastrous consequences for example, American research. I have no idea how you would have faculty who are productive without any dollars to pay them. So I think being realistic, it's a pie-in-the-sky vision that is very unlikely to be realized.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, there are a lot of additional challenges that would come up that have to do with who would actually be served at which public institutions, right? It's already the case that many state institutions, not just the flagship universities, but many of the broader range of state institutions have diminishing funding and increasing numbers of students who wish to go there, right? So if you then make those institutions somehow with magical funding from the sky free for folks, you have a rush of new students coming there. Presumably those institutions then become more selective, right, along some set of criteria, right? So some set of students are going to get pushed out of those institutions as a result. And the cycle that you get into there does not necessarily turn out to be one that builds more inclusion for a broader range of students and families in their access to a high-quality higher education.
So I would say, I mean, Damon, the plan was untenable, but there's a salutary principle behind the idea, and that is that we should have a public investment in higher education that creates greater access. He's absolutely right about that, and we were talking about that earlier. And this is a way that America is drifting in the wrong direction. Georgia was earlier, making reference to China and Germany, where, societies where it is a given that one of the most sound investments that public investments that you can make is in the education of your citizenry. And if you look at the recent history of American funding of education period, but higher education in particular, we are definitely heading in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not that that's a bad idea. And in fact, when you look to the European countries, by and large, higher education is free. But it's because of that public investment that we are not making here.
Hi, I would like your observation on kind of a non-academic aspect of the College of Wooster. So when I was a student here, we had 3.2 beer, we had clubs and houses and sections, and I just picked up my copy of the Wooster Voice and checked out the signs in the bathroom and all the current issues. And I just wondered if you could comment on non-academic social life for students at the College of Wooster.
Sure. Absolutely. It's incredibly important. The large majority of the time that students spend here is time when they are not in class, and I might even venture to say time when they are not studying. It's absolutely, studying is very important. People do not do it 120 hours a week. It's incredibly important that our students are physically safe here. And we need to undertake all of the policies and experiences that we can in helping them have a safe college experience. If students are not physically safe, it doesn't matter how excellent our academic opportunities are. It simply doesn't matter. If they're being harmed, then they can't study effectively and they can't get the most out of the education that we offer here. So there's a lot of work that goes into those questions, right? That those questions do have to do with helping students engage in a social life that is certainly joyful. We're not telling 18-year-olds to just, sit around and study all the time. That's not the solution to the kinds of concerns that are represented in the voice. We want people to have a joyful, healthy social life in which they're interacting in good ways with one another and making the most of the community and learning from one another. Young people are risk-taking, right? That's a thing that young people do. But there's also good evidence, there are good national best practices that we can use to help make those things come together here. It's not impossible to have young people have a good, healthy social life that is safe in the right ways and joyful and celebratory in the right ways. Those do have to do with thinking about things like, what are the spaces where people can gather? What are the ways that we help students get together and have good events that are positive for them? What are the ways that we help students build communities? And you asked the question about the sections. That's certainly one of those kinds of things. What are the ways that we have a social life that works inclusively for everyone? This is a question I think about a lot. So when things don't go well in social life, there are questions that have to do with physical safety, but there are also questions that have to do with welcome, right? Are the kinds of social opportunities available that will actually work for all students that make this place feel like home for them? And then there are also some really practical things we need to do in terms of, to your point, prevention of harm, right? Prevention of harm that has to do with students drinking in unsafe ways, prevention of harm that has to do with sexual violence. And there are a lot of work that we can do there. And again, there are national best practices that we can take up. I think the college has done a lot of work in that space, and we have more distance to travel. We have a pretty good sense of where we want to go and how we want to move those things. And in doing that, again, we're really thinking about intersecting what we know from essentially national public health work, because these are essentially public health questions, in the ways that they intersect with the particulars of student life here at the College of Wooster. Every college has its own student culture and its own student world, its own ways that communities come together, their own ways that residential life works. So the work that we're engaging in has to do with bringing together those national best practices with the particularities of Wooster to ensure that students have the most vibrant and healthy social life that they can have here.
And I would add that I think it's very important for Wooster and all residential liberal arts colleges to remember that we're a residential campus on purpose. We believe that living and learning together is actually part of our mission. It's essentially how we discharge our mission. And, John Dewey talked about the fact that in a democracy, the process of living together educates. And that's what we're trying to engage. And you know what? The social landscape is complex. And so the negotiations and the kind of moderations and the behaviors that our students are working with, practicing with, failing with, we have to be in there with them, just like we're in their academic pursuits, helping them develop, grow, become more sophisticated, become more humane through the pathway. But it's a core to our mission. It's part of what we do.
Thank you. We heard quite a lot, I think, about what is expected of our students, both in terms of requirements to get into Wooster, which have changed, and what they will do while they are here. I would like to extend, I guess I would say, my role as faculty advocate. When I became dean, many of my colleagues thought of me as the other, until they realized that I really was a faculty advocate. And in that role, I'd like to ask, what are you asking of faculty, and what are you expecting of them, and what will you provide for them in the future? And that too has changed, I know, because there was at one time when we did not consider a faculty member unless he or she had some kind of experience prior to coming to Wooster in a small liberal arts setting. And I know that's no longer the case. Help me with that question. What do you expect of your faculty? What will you give of your faculty?
That's a great question. So I'll start, and I'm sure there are other folks who want to chime in because this is not a question that only applies to Wooster. Our faculty are in many sense the heart of the institution, right? The students are the heart of the institution because they are our purpose, but individual students come and stay about 4 years and then they move on, right? The teaching that happens in classrooms but also out of classrooms is carried by the faculty, and in many ways the goals that we have for the learning of our students is embodied in the interaction of those faculty with our students. So you're absolutely right that getting this right is very, very important. And we want faculty to come here and to have rich professional lives and to stay, to do what you did and to become a leader of the college that brings forward its goals as well as to teach in their classes in particular. You know, to your specific question about whether it's a good idea or not a good idea for faculty who have had some experience in liberal arts colleges before they come here, which, you know, I'll just say something about sort of where faculty come from. I think that the college is vastly strengthened if our faculty have, again, a broad range of experiences, a broad range of perspectives. Historically, many of our colleges had a very narrow way of thinking about how they drew their faculty, right? So they might have a couple of institutions from which faculty regularly came, and when there was an opening, they would just go to those institutions and say, who do you have coming out of the English department? And then they just bring that person over because that was kind of a known quantity. That's a good way to produce a faculty where people are very much like one another in their history and their experiences. I don't think that's what we need to be doing as a college now. And even more recently, colleges have often, when they're searching for new faculty, used the kinds of encoding around ranking, for example, that Stan was mentioning, as a kind of way of guessing who might be a good faculty member, right? This person went to this institution, they studied at that institution, so that probably means that they're the person that we want. You know, in fact, our wonderful faculty here and the faculty we seek to draw from for the future are coming from all over, right? They themselves are coming from communities across the world and across the country. They're coming up through a whole variety of different kinds of educational experiences, community colleges, public universities, private colleges, international institutions, and we want and need that. So if we're going to bring faculty from all over, and I think it's very important that we do that and from a wide range of educational experiences and communities, then we need to think about what we do for them when they get here, right? How then do we help them become successful teachers and successful researchers? And I think that's something that Wooster and many other colleges have taken much more seriously over the years, right? There used to be a kind of perspective around faculty development at many places. I'm not positive about Wooster, but I suspect this was true, which just had to do with, well, you show up, and then you're supposed to figure out how to teach, and a few years later we'll check and see if you've gotten good at it enough, and you'll figure out how to do research, and we'll check a few years later and see if you've gotten good at it. And if the answer is yes, we'll invite you to stay forever, and we'll celebrate. And if the answer is no, we will thank you and wish you adieu, right? So that approach turns out not to be a great way to make use of the college's investment in bringing new faculty here and starting them and and bringing the right people to the college. We are now much more invested, and I think should continue to be more invested in genuine faculty development, understanding that our faculty come from many places. We are working with them and with their potential when they arrive, and we really need to help them think about how do they become good teachers? How do they learn to teach in the particular ways that we require of our faculty? Georgia, I know this is something that you asked when you first got here. You said, oh, this independent study thing is great. How exactly do faculty get to be any good at that critical mentoring relationship that's the heart of what we do? That's a super important question. It's an important question about first-year seminar. It's an important question for faculty at all stages, actually, of their professional lives. As their classrooms change, as new and different students are coming in and out of their classrooms, we need to be helping all of our faculty, not only our new faculty, learn how to be effective in the classrooms that consist of the students that we're bringing towards the goals that we articulate, for example, in our graduate qualities. So that kind of intentional work, that intentional faculty development, I think is very, very important, and it's something that we need to continue to build. On the flip side, I agree we need to keep supporting faculty with this. We need this to be a joyful and rewarding career. I think in general it still is. There are a lot of pieces of that. And some of those have to do with faculty community as well, actually, with bringing people together in the faculty and helping them all have the sense and the deep understanding of the ways that they're pulling the college forward together.
40 years is a very long time for a career, and it's impossible to expect people to stay exactly the same from year 1 to year 40. I think a very complex issue, which perhaps none of us feel we figured out perfectly, is how to understand and react to and prepare for and help the various stages through which faculty go through in those 40 years, and make sure the institution understands those and is able to support those various stages at the natural time. Some people's career trajectories will keep them developing as teachers and researchers. Others may move on to more administrative responsibilities, but really understanding those trajectories and stages is very important.
I just need to defend myself. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think I probably did not express my concern clearly.
Sure.
I used the example of previous experience in a small liberal arts school simply as an indication of one of the changes we've already made, not as a limitation on how we should be doing it now.
Right.
And I just felt, as I say, I needed to defend myself about
Right.
that.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate your wisdom on this direction is super helpful. I understand. Thank you.
Can I respond to that a bit? Your question was, what are we expecting of faculty? And I would say that there are some very large expectations and complex expectations for faculty today that would hold true across colleges. I'll say a word about those. And then there are the virtually unique expectations of Wooster. And a lot of places we've touched on this already, a lot of places talk about scholar teachers or some such phrase. That is raised to the highest level at Wooster. So there are some very specific and very difficult expectations here, I think, because we really do expect our faculty to be of the highest quality as researchers, and likewise to be completely dedicated and effective in the classroom. And that's a very high bar. So there's that unique set of expectations. But beyond that, we've been talking a lot about the complications of the society in which we live today and the communities that we bring together on our campuses. And we haven't really talked about the fact that places demands and possibilities and expectations on faculty that in many cases are new and different and difficult. The other thing that we haven't mentioned at all, which is kind of extraordinary, is the changing modes of information and digital technologies. So faculty today are needing to learn entirely new ways of thinking about their own research, helping students to carry out research, thinking about what it means to convey your knowledge. That used to be write a 20-page paper. Today, maybe it's start a blog or create a video or create a website collegially with your colleagues and so with your students and so forth. So there's an enormous new set of expectations and demands, I think, and it behooves us to really be conscious of that and thinking about how we can help faculty to meet those expectations and that high bar.
I think I'd like to make a couple comments about this. Thanks for your question, Yvonne. The first thing I'd like to say is just the very simple observation that we are all faculty, right? The presidents that Wooster has chosen all began their careers as faculty, and I think that therefore you're going to find, across this whole table, people who deeply understand and appreciate the role of faculty in the mission of these colleges. But the thing I want to share with you, the Wooster family, is the way Wooster considers the faculty is precious and becoming increasingly rare, because Wooster maintains a commitment to the ideal of a full-time faculty member whose only work is the mission of this college. And increasingly higher education is losing that model of what it means to be a faculty member. It's losing it rapidly. The faculty ranks of what are called contingent faculty, adjunct faculty, are growing, and the ranks of tenure or tenure track or continuing faculty are shrinking. And that means the whole model of what it means to be a faculty member in higher education is shifting, and not to the good of our mission and not to the good of our students. I mean, our faculty will have peers, age peers out there who are teaching at 4 different places, and they're teaching 8 courses a semester and driving between them. What is their commitment to the mission of the colleges that they serve? What can be their commitment to the students? So Wooster has, and it's essential here, that just positively couldn't work at Wooster. We could not discharge our mission with integrity with that model of academic labor. So the model of being a faculty member at Wooster is precious, and I encourage us all to really defend it.
Hi. So you've all very articulately described the value proposition of a liberal arts education to individuals and to society, and I think tomorrow we'll explore some of that also in terms of its value proposition to community. In a few weeks, we'll have a new president who will be building an agenda. And I'm very curious how you think about translating the value proposition of a liberal arts education into a federal policy agenda. I mean, to what extent does and can the federal government offer more support, opportunities, incentives for the kinds of education goals that you've described?
Really, Erica? You had to go there?
Yeah,
Don't all jump in at once.
I'll toss out an idea that has come to me several times, and when I mention it, people are sure that I'm insane. We brag in this country, I think with good reason, that the nature of the country and our expectations, with the best of intentions, are that anybody could aspire to become president of this country. Now, I say sometimes in a lighter mood that we say how true that might be, I suppose, in some ways. But it does raise to me the question, Eric, that comes to me all the time. If it's really the case that we want to brag about the fact that anybody could be president in this country, why isn't our educational system aiming as if anybody might be? Our educational system ought to be teaching every single child as if that child might become president.
And I think in part we need, well, I'll tell you one practical thing I would love to see, Erica, and that is to see someone as the Secretary of Education who actually knows something about higher education. We have not had that. And I don't mean that in a snarky way. I mean, it is simply the case that the folks who have been in that role do not have experience in this sector. Now, K through 12 education has its own issues and is very important, but it would be wonderful if we had someone who was actually knowledgeable about higher education. But I think it behooves those of us who have had wonderful educations and who know the benefits of them and who know the life-enriching qualities and so forth, to raise our voices. I think that's one way, I would hope that that's one way that we can come more to the attention of the policymakers. And by and large, as we know, the graduates of our colleges are leaders in every domain of human endeavor in this country, and yet we hear very little of them speaking up about what made that possible for them. So I would hope that we could mobilize that voice more.
So, Erica, what I'm going to say is that higher education policy, as is talked about at the federal level, has been reduced to job training. And it is so much more than that. We are making a go at a democracy. And so this was Stan's point. That means that our educational agenda has to embrace the goal of educating every single citizen to have the wherewithal to be able to participate as a critical thinker in a democracy so that we can self-govern. You almost never hear that talked about. I mean, whenever I go to the Hill and visit with senators and congressmen, you know, they directly link that the value of higher education reduces to job training. And I think that that really completely misses some of the most important things for our society and its prospects.
I hate to have one more question on value and cost, but so after I left Wooster, I went to Carnegie Mellon and got a master's, and I fell into jobs in design and technology, where I still work. And fast forward 20 years later, 50% of the kids that we're hiring in my particular department came out of the same program I went to at CMU. And a lot of them did a really smart thing, and they did an accelerated 5-year program where they got a bachelor's and a master's. And I'm thinking, man, that was pretty smart. And you know that I've clearly drunk the Wooster Kool-Aid, but how do we make a case for when you see something like that that seems really practical, although that's a very different kind of institution, how do you make a case for Wooster for someone you know, that has been through that experience, or, for example, my nieces? How do I make a case for them unless I'm going to volunteer to pay for Wooster? It seems, you know what I mean, it seems a little decadent, and how do we articulate what the value is, and how do we prove what the value is?
Well, I don't mind starting this one, and it's not a complete answer, but in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he writes about practical wisdom, and a practical education is actually an education that equips you to live well, which includes having a gainful employment, but it includes so much more than that. So I guess what I resist is reducing the idea of practicality to training. I think a liberal education embraces a much deeper sense of practical. I think it's the most practical education you can possibly get, actually. And I could go on about the basis that it gives you for flexibility and creativity, and, you know, having the furniture in your mind to be able to live a good human life. But I know that's not a complete answer, but that's, if we were having a conversation, that's what I would like to talk about.
Right. And I think I would just pick up from that, which is completely true, and say that that education and the education that you're describing are not somehow mutually exclusive, right? So you can have an education that reaches the broad goals and capacities that Grant is talking about, and also move from that education into something more specific or more concrete, or intersect that education with various ways that one might apply it in the world. You can do that while you're undertaking your undergraduate education. You can do it afterwards. There are a variety of ways that students take their 4 years at Wooster and the broad engagement and exploration that they have there, the learning that they have in terms of analysis and expression, and then connect it to that next step, right? So even just to take your very specific example, what can one do in 5 years, right? So in 5 years, one can do the 4 years of the education that you described, during which one also is going out and making various explorations of how all of the different things that one is learning connect to various possible futures, right? So you could learn a little bit as you are working out in the world about how your art history class might actually make you a better teacher, or a better learner, or a better designer, or help you think differently about the world. You could also learn those things about your mathematics class. You could learn those in conversation with professionals who come to campus and talk about the things that they learned that were most valuable to them in their professional lives, and the ways that they were surprised by those, right? And then you could also obviously take that learning, as our students so successfully do, and move on to graduate work, for example, in a variety of more specific fields that might actually then provide other levels that go beyond that. But I think there are a lot of different ways that those two things can come together, and they're not mutually exclusive in ways that are important to realize.
But what I heard in your question, and I face it with my granddaughters, is how do you convince your nieces? And is this the kind of language that will convince them? Or is the other, I don't know, what are your ideas? What have you tried to do?
Good question. Back at me. So, well, pretty much what the same talk that we all probably had even coming into Worcester, right? Oh, you'll get a well-rounded education, you'll be a much better person, you'll be a much better student of the universe, whatever. But it's a tough sell when you're talking about, is it what, $50,000 a year now? And it sounds almost decadent and kind of squishy, and I'm not quite sure how to make it seem more practical, and also, and maybe that's through examples of recent grads who've jumped out of here and gone on to work for Obama or something like that. You know, like maybe it's case studies, or I don't know exactly what it is.
You know, I think you make a good point, right? That this is changing, but historically liberal arts colleges have not done a particularly fantastic job of answering the question that you have, right? Sometimes the answer that we have made both for folks who are trying to learn about us or for our own students is of the form, do what you love and don't worry about the rest, right? And there's a beauty to that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing what you love, and there's nothing wrong with not worrying. But it is really necessary that we think about the realities, the real imperatives that our students and their families are facing when we think about how we talk about what we do and when we decide in a fundamental way what it is that we do, right? Because for students, for example, who are coming from families that are under a lot of economic strain, to say it doesn't matter what you're making in your first couple of jobs out of college is just disrespectful. I mean, it's just frankly disrespectful. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing people should be thinking about, but it is the case that we need to be understanding where folks are coming from in a wide variety of communities who might be considering the college. And we need to be talking concretely and in a way that takes into account the things that those families are facing about where this education can bring students, the ways that it can be transformative and powerful for them, both in the short term and in the long term, right? It's not either or. It's not like, oh, you only think about where this education will take you in your 80th year and it doesn't matter when you're 22. You can hold both of those things in conversation with one another, and I actually think that some of the data that Georgia's been talking about and bringing forward in terms of what actually is happening with liberal arts college graduates within 6 months of their graduation, what are they doing? And then what are they doing from there? And of course, when you're talking to young people and families, you're absolutely right. Stories are sometimes easier than, I mean, I like Excel spreadsheets, but that's not necessarily, and they're, you know, that's a good way to convey some things that are true, but it's probably not the thing that's going to speak most to a 17-year-old, right? And so we really need to think about what are the things that are true, fundamentally true about what we do and fundamentally true about what this education enables for students and as they go out into the world. And then how do we bring those in a way that has true meaning to the folks, to the students and the families who are considering what we do? And I think that's actually a substantial question.
So it's about 5 minutes to 4. We have time for, I think, one more question. And Catherine has the mic.
President Bolton.
Spencer.
Hello. Spencer. You spoke earlier of Dr. Lord's vision for Wooster, which he articulated as a school that would be open for all students, regardless of their background. And how over our first 150 years, we've worked to achieve this goal, and the different strengths are that our increased levels of diversity have brought Wooster. So my question is, what comes next? What does the future of diversity look like at Wooster, and what sort of strategies and policies are we going to need to continue to grow our diversity and to really support the students that we have here from diverse backgrounds for the next 150 years?
Thank you. That's a great question. And how long did you say we have?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because I actually
what you
think
need.
that what President Nugent said is exactly right, that there are fundamental and deep things that we need to do in all of our areas of work. That if we're doing the work that you described correctly, the work that will make it possible for all of our students to have an education here on genuinely equal terms, in a way that is deeply welcoming and supports all of their thriving, we actually have to look at everything, right? So everything from from, what are the classes that we offer? What are students' experiences in the classroom? How are we supporting faculty to ensure that they're doing a good job and able to support this thriving of the students in their classrooms? How are we bringing faculty here? How are we enabling the faculty who would best be able to support our students across a broad range of experiences and diversities? How are we making sure those folks make their way here to Wooster and choose to continue to work with us? We need to think about how we're funding education. How can we financially enable access for all of the strong students who are out there in the world and who might benefit from this education to really be able to make the most of this place independent of their families' financial circumstances, right? We need to be thinking about the challenging things that President Cornwell mentioned about the fact that Wooster is not a bubble. We are connected to the world, and as much as we try to create an equitable experience for our students here, they are coming from experiences in the world that are not equitable. High school education in the United States is not an equitable system, right? There is a range of opportunities for young people that goes from everything you could possibly imagine to schools that are so strained that students may never see a guidance counselor. They may have access to only very few classes. We want to welcome all of the strong, hardworking students here from all of those different environments and support them so that they can succeed. So we need to think about, what does that mean academically? What does it mean in terms of the academic supports that we offer? What does it mean in terms of advising and guidance and the ways that we can support students, meeting them where they are when they get here and helping them make the most of the place? It means asking all kinds of practical questions. How are we ensuring that families that are not English speaking can learn something about the college either that their student is considering or the college that their student attends? What are we doing about those kinds of family supports that would allow families to support their students who are here if the families themselves have no experience of a place like this? It has to do with how we build buildings, right? If we think about residential life, and as you said, the ways that our promise is enacted in many ways through the experiences and the learning that students have with one another, how are we making that work well? That has to do with how do we build buildings physically where students have great opportunities to come together, have spaces where they're drawn together, but also have support so that when those students with different experiences have a disagreement or are coming from very different places, they're well supported in finding ways to learn from one another and then become closer and understand one another better instead of moving off into chasms of misunderstanding and falling away, right? And those are real possibilities. They're programmatic possibilities, they're physical possibilities, there's financial possibility there, but they require a deep commitment that infuses literally everything that we do, and it requires that we look at everything we do with the eyes that you just described, right? Asking the question that you just described, if this is our mission, then when we look at every single thing that we do, we ask, how is that thing meeting that mission, right? What are we missing, and how can we make sure that we're looking at it from all possible perspectives, not just the perspective that I particularly have based on my own experiences, but all possible experiences and perspectives to be sure that we're doing it as well as we can. That's a long journey. It doesn't happen instantly. People have been working on it for a long time, and we have a ways to go, but I think you're asking exactly the right question, and that it has to infuse every single thing that we do for us to move forward and make the best future for the college.
And I can think of no better note on which to end this panel. Exactly on time.